This is the User Adoption Podcast with your host, Henrik de Gyor.
Who are you and what do you do?
Hi, Henrik. It's good to talk with you. Just to give you a little background about myself. Again, my name is Bill Tancer. I'm an author, a keynote speaker, and I specialize in online consumer behavior. Also, just recently joined a startup. I'm the COO of a company called Data and Action Analytics, where we study user activity on networks using artificial intelligence.
Bill, how are you involved with user adoption?
Probably the best way to describe my involvement with user adoption is going back to my time as the general manager of global research at Experian and at a company called Hitwise, which Experian had acquired. And while I was there, I spent quite a lot of time in their data set, which I wrote a book on in 2008 called Click, What Millions Do Online and Why It Matters, studying what consumers do online. And I actually devoted a few chapters of that book, as well as several columns on the topic of what I could see in online behavior and what it could tell us about the way users adopted different types of online services.
Bill, what are the biggest challenges and successes with user adoption?
The foundation that I have in online user adoption is going back to a book I read in undergrad business school, which is The Diffusion of Innovation by Ev Rogers, a book that came out in the 70s. And that book was really fundamental in my understanding of how users adopted both products and services. And your listeners probably know Ev Rogers' work through the diffusion of innovation curve, that bell curve that had early adopters and innovators on the left-hand side going to early mainstream, late mainstream, and laggards on the right-hand side of the curve. And way back, I think back in 2005, using the data set at Hitwise and later the Experian data sets, I set out on a mission, and that was to visualize that adoption curve. So I could look at any site, and I started, I think, way back 2005, 2006 with YouTube, and visualize the users that were using the service in the very early days. And by rolling the data back to when YouTube launched, I could actually look at innovators and early adopters. Using our system, I then was able to profile those users and put them into psychographic categories that we track, groups like the young digerati. What was very cool about that type of analysis is that I could then look at what the young digerati were doing throughout their online lives and peg other services that were being picked up by early adopters, which gave us a head start in tracking sites that we believed might have a chance of crossing over or crossing the chasm in the phrase that Jeffrey Moore pioneered in his chasm. We could actually visualize that jump over from an early adopter and innovator into a mainstream user. The biggest challenge to your question today is that user adoption, we go back to Ev Rogers' book and what he studied in the 1930s. And for example, he talked about the adoption of hybrid corn seed by farmers was a period of time that crossing the chasm took about 12 years. And with what we have today in mobile and social media, that chasm crossing can take a matter of weeks and sometimes even just a few days. So the biggest challenge is that user adoption happens very quickly today. And the challenge for us as researchers, analysts, and business people is being able to get a handle on what's happening in user adoption when we're really in a phase of hyper adoption. I think if we look at the biggest successes in user adoption, I think it's the flip side. Is since things are happening so quickly, they're happening repeatedly with great amount of frequency, it allows you to gather more and more data about early adopters. And like I had used that example of studying YouTube, we can now, using different data sets, start to understand who early adopters are and then make better decisions as marketers to attract those individuals to our services and hopefully get onto the far left side of that adoption curve across the chasm.
And what advice would you like to share with people working on improving user adoption?
So I would say that probably the best thing you can do is study the users of your own products and services. And if you are early to the game, maybe you haven't launched a product or service yet, you're thinking about doing it, then do some competitive intelligence. Look to products and services in your category, and then study who used those products and services in the very early days. Now, if you can, like I did, get access to a massive data set that can give you some insight as to who is using your competitors' products in the early days. If not, it might take just some guerrilla market research to go out, find people that are using or used a competitor's product or service in the very early days before it became successful, to understand who might be the early adopter for what you're going to offer. And then with that in mind, you should try and think of ways that you can market to that specific group. And today, you're also trying to find influencers within that group. So if you remember back to the diffusion of innovation curve, it's not enough just to attract innovators and adopters. You've got to get those individuals that you think will give you the best chance of crossing over into the mainstream. So you're looking people that might have social media megaphones. They're got tons of followers. It's really one of the keys, even today, about crossing the chasm in influencer marketing, in addition to finding those influencers that are the innovators. So I think that's the best advice that you can give your listeners is do some research. If you've got research on your own data and where you've been successful, identify the early adopters and innovators there. If not, then go out to your competitive set and do that same analysis, but at the same time, look for influencers that meet the definition of the innovators and influencers for your particular product.
Where can we learn more information about user adoption and your work on the subject?
Well, for my work, the best source would be my first book, which was called Click, What Millions Do and Why It Matters, published in 2008 by Hyperion. While it's now 10 years old, I think the lessons about adoption, user adoption, are still very usable. I've also written a number of columns on the topic, but I suggest that your listeners also go and get a copy of Diffusion of Innovation, Ev Rogers' book. Now, it might seem silly to read a book from the 1970s today, but the foundation that Rogers laid out in that book is still very true. The only difference is that we're in time compression now in user adoption. So read that book. I'm also a huge fan of Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm. When read together with Ev Rogers' Diffusion of Innovation, will really give your listeners a solid foundation in best thinking in user adoption. And those of your listeners that might remember Jeffrey Moore came out with Crossing the Chasm in the early 90s. He just published the third edition in 2014, an updated edition. So I strongly urge everyone to read that. Read Ev Rogers' Diffusion of Innovation, as well as Click, my book. And all three should give you a pretty solid foundation in today's environment of hyper-innovation.
For more on this, visit useradoptionpodcast.com. Don't forget to please subscribe, rate, and review. And for a book about this, check out useradoptionbook.com. Tune in next week for the next episode. Thanks for listening.